Part 4, Angelo Bruno, the Docile Don. Welcome to Deep Sleep, the home of authentic organized crime audiobooks. In the previous episodes, we have discussed the early years of the Philadelphia crime family. In this episode, I'm going to tell you the story of the time of Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno, known as Quiet Don or Docile Don, was the symbol of the Philly mob's years in peace. However, ironically, he was shot to death as the opposite of his calm, profit-oriented management style. Before starting the episode, I would like to add two crucial information which I think I forgot to mention in the previous episodes. Firstly, the Philadelphia crime family, as we call it today, the Philly mob, had been named as the Greaser Gang in various documents, including FBI reports and newspaper articles. The Philadelphia family started to be called Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra family, starting in the 1980s. I reckon this refers to the lack of the government officials understanding the structure of the National Crime Syndicate before 1980. Another information that might have been skipped is Nicola Gentile's claim for his made man status. In his memoirs, Vita di Capomafia, which was released in 1963, he claims he was accepted into La Cosa Nostra in Philadelphia in 1905. There is no additional evidence to support his claim, but this could mean the presence of a La Cosa Nostra family before 1919, as we suggested Sabella's organization is the foundation of the Philadelphia mafia. Let us know your thoughts about this in the comments. Now, pick your sweetest spot and enjoy tonight's episode. Chapter 21. Let's meet Angelo Bruno. In the spring of 1910, in a small Sicilian town nestled in the hills of Caltanissetta province, a child was born who would one day reshape organized crime in Philadelphia. Angelo Annaloro entered the world on May 21st in Villalba, a place where old traditions ran deep and family bonds meant everything. His father, Michael Bruno Annaloro, worked the land like generations before him. His mother, Vincenzina, known to everyone as Jenny, managed their modest household. Angelo was their second child. His older sister Josephine had arrived 2 years earlier, and in time 2 younger brothers would follow, Victor and Joseph. The Annaloro family lived simply, surrounded by the ancient customs of their Sicilian village. But like so many Italian families of that era, the Annaloros looked westward, toward America, where opportunity seemed boundless and futures could be remade. In early May of 1911, when Angelo was barely 1 year old, the family made their journey across the Atlantic. They carried little more than their belongings and their hopes, joining the great wave of Italian immigration that was transforming American cities. Their destination was Philadelphia, a city already home to thousands of their countrymen. The family settled in Feltonville, in the northern reaches of Philadelphia. It was a working-class neighborhood where Italian immigrants clustered together, creating small versions of the villages they'd left behind. Here, familiar dialects could be heard on street corners, traditional foods could be found in small shops, and the old ways mixed with the new American reality. Michael Annaloro found work as a foundry worker. It was hard, hot labor melting and pouring metal in conditions that tested a man's endurance. But it was steady work, and Michael did what countless immigrants did. He persevered. He saved what he could, learned what English he needed, and kept his focus on building something better for his children. After some time in the foundry, Michael saw an opportunity. At 4341 North 6th Street in Feltonville, he opened a small grocery store. It was modest, but it was his own. The store became a gathering place for the neighborhood's Italian families, a spot where they could buy familiar foods, speak their native language, and maintain connections to the world they'd left behind. Young Angelo grew up in this environment, surrounded by the immigrant experience. He heard Sicilian spoken as often as English. He saw his father work endless hours to make the store succeed. He learned the importance of community connections and the delicate balance of life between two cultures. In the early 1920s, when Angelo was approaching his teenage years, the family made another move. They left Feltonville and relocated to South Philadelphia, joining the densest concentration of Italian Americans in the city. South Philadelphia was becoming the heart of Italian immigrant life. Its markets, its churches, its social clubs all reflected the vibrant culture the immigrants had brought with them. The narrow streets of South Philadelphia teemed with life. Vendors sold fresh produce from carts. Women shopped for the day's meals at outdoor markets. Men gathered in social clubs to play cards and discuss the news from the old country. Children played stickball in the streets while grandmothers watched from stoops and windows. It was here, in this close-knit community, that Angelo would truly come of age. Angelo enrolled at South Philadelphia High School, an imposing building that educated children from all the neighborhood's immigrant groups. But formal education held limited appeal for the young man. After 2 years, he made the decision that many immigrant children made. He left school to work and contribute to the family's fortunes. Rather than joining his father's grocery operation, Angelo struck out to establish his own. At the corner of 8th and Annin Streets, he opened a small grocery store. It was a bold move for someone so young, but Angelo had grown up watching his father run a business. He understood the neighborhood, knew the customers, and spoke their language, literally. Angelo was fluent in the Sicilian dialect, that distinctive way of speaking that immediately identified someone's regional origins. This linguistic skill proved invaluable. In a community where many of the older generation spoke little English, Angelo could communicate with ease. He became known as a young man who understood and respected the traditional ways. His reputation in the Italian community grew steadily. Neighbors found him polite and respectful. He attended church services regularly, maintaining the religious observances his family valued. He dressed neatly, conducted himself with a quiet dignity unusual in someone so young. People began to notice Angelo Bruno Annaloro. It was around this time that Angelo made a subtle but significant change. He began using his grandmother's surname, Bruno, rather than Annaloro. The modification served a practical purpose in a society where shorter, simpler names were easier for non-Italians to pronounce and remember. Angelo Bruno sounded less foreign than Angelo Annaloro. It was a small adaptation to American life, one of many that immigrants and their children made as they sought to find their place in their adopted country. As Angelo Bruno, he found it easier to navigate between the Italian community and the broader American world. The name became part of his identity, the name by which he would be known for the rest of his life. As the 1920s progressed, Angelo's world was shaped by the larger forces transforming America. Prohibition had become the law of the land in 1920, outlawing the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The intention was to reduce crime and corruption, to improve health and morality. The reality proved quite different. Prohibition created an enormous underground economy. Americans still wanted to drink, and they were willing to pay handsomely for illegal alcohol. This created opportunities for anyone willing to take the risks involved in bootlegging, smuggling, manufacturing, and selling liquor in defiance of federal law. In cities across America, organized crime groups seized this opportunity. In Philadelphia, the mafia operated under the leadership of Salvatore Sabella, a Sicilian immigrant who had established control over much of the city's Italian underworld. Sabella's organization ran various illegal enterprises, but prohibition provided unprecedented profits. Angelo Bruno, still in his late teens, became connected to this world. Exactly how and when remains unclear. Such transitions rarely left clear records. But by the late 1920s, Angelo had joined the Philadelphia mafia family. His entry into organized crime likely seemed a natural progression. In the Italian neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, the mafia was an established presence. It operated protection rackets, controlled unions, and now dominated the bootlegging trade. For a young man with ambition, intelligence, and the right connections, the organization offered opportunities that legitimate businesses could not match. Angelo became involved in two primary activities. First, he ran numbers rackets, an illegal lottery popular in working-class neighborhoods. People would place small bets on various number combinations, hoping for a substantial payout. The odds were heavily in the house's favor, making it a reliable source of income for those who controlled it. Second, Angelo participated in bootlegging operations. This meant securing supplies of illegal liquor, whether smuggled from Canada, produced in local stills, or diverted from legitimate sources, and distributing it to speakeasies, clubs, and individual customers. The work involved risk, but the profits were substantial. Despite his involvement in illegal activities, Angelo maintained his reputation in the neighborhood as a respectable young man. He continued to attend church. He remained polite and soft-spoken. He dressed conservatively, avoiding the flashy style some gangsters adopted. To many who knew him casually, he was simply Angelo Bruno, a businessman in the neighborhood. This dual existence, respected community member and organized crime figure, would become a hallmark of Angelo's life. He understood instinctively that maintaining good relations with the community provided protection and opportunities that force and fear could not. In 1931, at the age of 21, Angelo married Assunta Maranca, known to everyone as Sue. She came from a respectable Italian family in the neighborhood, and their wedding was celebrated in the traditional manner, with family and community gathering to witness the union. The marriage would prove remarkably stable, especially given Angelo's chosen profession. In a world where many mobsters maintained mistresses and carried on affairs openly, Angelo remained devoted to his wife. It was unusual enough to be noteworthy, another aspect of his reputation as a different kind of gangster. The following year, in 1932, Sue gave birth to their first child, a son they named Michael. The arrival of a child brought new dimensions to Angelo's life. He was now not just a husband, but a father, with responsibilities that extended into the future. As Angelo settled into family life, he continued his activities within the Philadelphia crime family. The early 1930s were turbulent times for organized crime nationally. Prohibition was clearly failing and would soon be repealed. The Great Depression had devastated the economy, creating new hardships but also new opportunities for those in illegal enterprises. In Philadelphia, the mafia family was navigating its own transitions. Leadership questions arose as older members, aged and younger ones, sought greater authority. Rivalries between different factions created tensions. Angelo, still relatively young, observed these dynamics carefully. He learned who held real power, who could be trusted, who harbored dangerous ambitions. He developed a reputation for careful judgment and discretion. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Angelo didn't seek the spotlight. He spoke little and listened much. He avoided unnecessary conflicts and maintained cordial relations with various factions within the family. These qualities would serve him well in the years to come. Outside his criminal activities, Angelo cultivated an image of normalcy. He could often be seen in the neighborhood, a cigar in hand, stopping to chat with neighbors and shopkeepers. He attended church services at the local parish. He participated in community events. He was known as a gentleman, polite, soft-spoken, respectful of others. This wasn't merely a disguise or a calculated deception. Angelo genuinely valued these aspects of traditional Italian community life. He believed in showing respect to elders, maintaining family honor, keeping one's word. These values coexisted with his criminal activities without apparent contradiction in his mind. He was a product of a culture where such dualities were understood and accepted. In many ways, Angelo embodied a particular type of Italian-American experience. He had arrived as an infant immigrant, grown up between two worlds, and found his path in the complex social landscape of an ethnic urban neighborhood. His choices led him into organized crime, but his character and style reflected deeper cultural values. By the mid-1930s, Angelo Bruno had established himself as a reliable, intelligent member of the Philadelphia mafia family. He had a wife and young son. He had proven himself capable in various criminal enterprises. He had earned respect from both superiors and peers. But he was still a relatively minor figure in the organization's hierarchy. The path from where he stood to the leadership of the entire family seemed distant and uncertain. The journey would take decades and would be shaped by forces both within the organization and in the broader world beyond it. For now, Angelo Bruno was simply a South Philadelphia gangster trying to make his way in a complex and dangerous world, while maintaining his role as a husband, a father, and a respected member of his community. Chapter 22. The Rise of Docile Don. In the early 1950s, while Philadelphia rebuilt itself after the war, a different kind of reconstruction was taking place in the city's underworld. Marco Reginelli, a prominent figure in South Philadelphia's organized crime circles, had built a lucrative empire on two of the city's oldest vices, numbers and loan sharking. These were not flashy operations. They required patience, discretion, and an exceptional head for figures. In Angelo Bruno, Reginelli found exactly the partner he needed. The numbers racket, sometimes called the Italian lottery, was woven into the fabric of working-class neighborhoods. Every day, thousands of Philadelphians placed small bets on three-digit numbers, hoping their choice would match the day's winning combination. The operation demanded meticulous record-keeping, careful coordination among street collectors, and an ability to manage vast sums of money flowing through dozens of hands. Bruno had demonstrated all of these skills during his earlier years running legitimate businesses. Now, as Reginelli's associate, he applied them to less legitimate enterprises. Loan sharking, the other pillar of Reginelli's operations, required a different skill set entirely. It demanded an understanding of human nature, the ability to assess risk, and, when necessary, the stomach to enforce payment through intimidation or worse. Bruno proved adept at all of it. He could calculate interest rates in his head, evaluate a borrower's ability to repay, and project earnings months in advance. More importantly, he understood that the most profitable collections came not from violence, but from the steady pressure of compounding debt. Under Reginelli's guidance, Bruno's role expanded beyond simple bookkeeping. He began managing entire operations, supervising collectors, and resolving disputes. His calm demeanor masked a sharp mind constantly calculating odds, margins, and risks. Associates noticed that Bruno rarely raised his voice, rarely made threats, and never acted impulsively. Yet debts were paid, operations ran smoothly, and profits climbed steadily upward. The partnership taught Bruno valuable lessons he would carry throughout his career. From Reginelli, he learned that sustainable criminal enterprises operated much like legitimate businesses. They required reliable employees, satisfied customers, and protection from competition. They thrived on routine and predictability, not chaos and violence. These principles would later define Bruno's entire approach to leadership. By the mid-1950s, Bruno's reputation had grown beyond the narrow world of numbers and loans. He had proven himself not just as an earner, but as someone who could manage multiple operations simultaneously without drawing unwanted attention. This reputation opened doors to more sophisticated ventures. Bruno recognized something many of his contemporaries did not. The real money in organized crime came not from the crimes themselves, but from investing the proceeds into legitimate businesses. Cash from numbers and loan sharking needed somewhere to go, somewhere it could multiply while appearing entirely legal. Bruno found those opportunities in the most ordinary of places. Vending machine routes became one of his earliest legitimate investments. Cigarette machines, candy dispensers, and later jukeboxes and pinball machines required constant servicing, regular restocking, and collection of coins. The business generated steady, documentable income that could absorb and legitimize money from less savory sources. More importantly, it gave Bruno a presence in hundreds of bars, restaurants, and social clubs across South Philadelphia, creating a network of locations useful for both business and intelligence gathering. Food distribution followed a similar pattern. Bruno invested in companies that supplied restaurants, corner stores, and small markets with everything from produce to canned goods. The businesses were profitable on their own, but they also provided perfect cover for moving money and exerting influence. A restaurant owner who bought his supplies through Bruno's distributors understood the relationship extended beyond simple commerce. Loyalty was expected. Loyalty was usually given. Construction represented another avenue for investment. Post-war Philadelphia was building and rebuilding constantly. New housing developments sprouted in the Northeast. Office buildings rose in Center City. Every project needed concrete, steel, and labor. Bruno's construction interests gave him influence over which contractors won bids, which unions supplied workers, and which suppliers provided materials. It was influence built not on violence, but on relationships, favors, and mutual benefit. Real estate became perhaps Bruno's most significant legitimate venture. He understood that in American cities, real estate was the ultimate store of value. Properties in South Philadelphia, particularly along the commercial corridors, represented both immediate rental income and long-term appreciation. Bruno acquired buildings quietly, often through intermediaries, building a portfolio that would eventually make him one of the neighborhood's largest landlords. In 1955, Bruno's business acumen extended beyond Philadelphia's borders. Records would later show his interest in the Aluminum Product Sales Corporation, based in Miami, Florida. The investment brought him into close association with Irving Carey, a businessman whose own connections spanned both legitimate commerce and the underworld. The Miami connection proved valuable, giving Bruno a foothold in Florida's growing economy and establishing relationships that would prove useful in the coming decades. Throughout the 1950s, as Bruno expanded his operations, he developed a reputation that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Where others in organized crime sought notoriety and respect through displays of violence and dominance, Bruno built his standing on three simple principles: reliability, toughness when necessary, and an exceptional ability to generate profits. Reliability meant that when Bruno gave his word, it was kept. If he agreed to a price, that price remained fixed. If he promised a favor, the favor was delivered. If he entered into a business arrangement, he honored its terms completely. In a world where trust was scarce and betrayal common, Bruno's consistency made him an invaluable partner. His toughness, though less frequently displayed than that of more volatile figures, was equally real. Bruno understood that in his world, perceived weakness invited challenges. When disputes arose, he addressed them firmly but without unnecessary bloodshed. When debts went unpaid, consequences followed, but they were measured and calculated. His violence, when it came, was surgical rather than spectacular, aimed at solving problems rather than making statements. Most importantly, Bruno had demonstrated an exceptional talent for making money. While other criminals chased quick scores and flashy heists, Bruno built systems that generated steady, reliable income. His operations were efficient, low profile, and remarkably profitable. Associates who worked with him prospered. Superiors who backed him saw their investments multiply. This earning ability, more than anything else, secured his future in the organization. Bruno's personal style reinforced his reputation. He dressed well but not ostentatiously, preferring quality suits in conservative colors. He lived in a modest row house in South Philadelphia, not a mansion in the suburbs. He drove decent cars but nothing that drew attention. He frequented local restaurants and social clubs, maintaining visibility in the neighborhood without courting publicity. It was a style that would later define his leadership as boss: quiet, high-profit operations with minimal publicity. As Bruno's standing grew within Philadelphia, he began cultivating relationships beyond the city's borders. Two of these connections would prove particularly significant in the years ahead. The first was with Carlo Gambino, a rising figure in New York's Mangano crime family. The connection between Bruno and Gambino ran deeper than simple business relationships. Both men traced their origins to the same region of Sicily, and their families had maintained connections across generations. When Bruno married Sue Maranca in 1931, he had joined a family with its own ties to the old country, connections that intertwined with Gambino's network. These weren't just criminal alliances, they were relationships rooted in shared heritage, mutual respect, and the kind of trust that transcended mere business arrangements. Gambino, who would later become one of New York's most powerful bosses, recognized in Bruno a kindred spirit. Both men preferred negotiation to violence, stability to chaos, and profit to glory. Their relationship, built on these shared values and reinforced by cultural ties, would prove crucial in the coming years when Philadelphia's leadership crisis demanded intervention from New York's commission. The second significant relationship was closer to home, just across the Delaware River in New Jersey. Sam DeCavalcante controlled organized crime operations in parts of northern New Jersey, and the proximity of his territory to Philadelphia made some level of cooperation necessary. Rather than fighting over jurisdictional boundaries or competing for the same rackets, Bruno and DeCavalcante established a working arrangement. Each respected the other's territory. They shared information when useful. They cooperated when profitable. It was another example of Bruno's preference for diplomacy over confrontation, for sustainable partnerships over short-term victories. These relationships positioned Bruno strategically within the broader landscape of East Coast organized crime. He was no longer just a Philadelphia figure. He was becoming a player in the larger network of families that controlled criminal operations from Boston to Florida. On November 14, 1957, law enforcement in upstate New York stumbled upon what would become one of the most significant events in organized crime history. At the rural estate of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York, dozens of the nation's top organized crime figures had gathered for what was apparently meant to be a national meeting. When police set up roadblocks and began questioning attendees, the meeting dissolved into chaos as bosses and underbosses fled through the surrounding woods. Among those present were Philadelphia boss Joseph Ida and acting capo Antonio Polina. Their attendance at Appalachian would have far-reaching consequences for Philadelphia's criminal organization and for Angelo Bruno's future. The immediate aftermath was severe. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies, which had long been aware of organized crime but lacked solid evidence of its national structure, suddenly had proof of coordination among criminal groups across the country. The names and faces of attendees were documented, photographed, and filed. Many of those present faced immediate legal pressure. Grand juries were convened. Indictments followed. For Joseph Ida, already in his 60s and facing the prospect of intense legal scrutiny, the exposure was too much. In 1958, less than a year after Appalachian, Ida fled to Italy, abandoning the organization he had led. His departure left Philadelphia's crime family in a precarious position. Without a clear boss and facing increased law enforcement attention, the family was vulnerable not just to prosecution but to interference from more powerful organizations in New York. Into this leadership vacuum stepped Antonio Polina, who had been serving as acting capo. Polina assumed he would naturally ascend to the position of boss, but his assumption proved problematic from the start. Polina lacked the qualities that inspired confidence among the family's members and its allies in New York. He was seen as impulsive, old-fashioned in his methods, and, most critically, unable to command the respect necessary to lead effectively. As doubts about his leadership grew, Polina became increasingly paranoid, seeing threats and challenges everywhere. His greatest perceived threat was Angelo Bruno. By 1958, Bruno had spent years building his reputation as a reliable earner with strong ties to New York and demonstrated leadership abilities. Many within the Philadelphia family saw him as a natural successor to Ida. Polina, aware of Bruno's growing influence and fearing he would be displaced, decided to eliminate the threat permanently. Polina turned to Ignazio Denaro, who served as underboss, with an order: kill Angelo Bruno. It was a decision that would seal Polina's fate, though not in the way he intended. Denaro faced a choice. He could follow the order and eliminate Bruno, securing his position under Polina's leadership. Or he could refuse, risking Polina's wrath but potentially backing a more capable leader in Bruno. Denaro chose the latter. Rather than carrying out the assassination, he went to Bruno and revealed the plot. The warning accomplished several things simultaneously. It exposed Polina as willing to order the murder of a MAID member without proper authorization from the Commission in New York, a serious violation of organizational protocol. It demonstrated Bruno's standing within the family, showing that even the underboss saw him as the better choice for leadership. And it gave Bruno powerful leverage in the coming power struggle. With his life threatened and the family in disarray, Bruno made a calculated decision. He would appeal directly to the Commission in New York, the ruling body that adjudicated disputes among the various crime families and maintained order within the national organization. The Commission, at that time, included the bosses of the 5 New York families along with representatives from other major cities. Their role was to prevent the kind of internal warfare that had plagued organized crime in earlier decades. When disputes arose that couldn't be resolved locally, the Commission served as final arbiter. Bruno's appeal was straightforward. He laid out Paulina's unfitness for leadership, the unauthorized murder plot, and the state of disarray into which the Philadelphia family had fallen. He presented himself not as seeking power, but as offering stability. He emphasized his business success, his established relationships with New York families, and his preference for the kind of quiet, profitable operations that benefited everyone. Critically, Bruno had powerful advocates on the Commission. Carlo Gambino, by then one of New York's most influential bosses, spoke forcefully in Bruno's favor. Thomas Lucchese, another major New York boss, also backed him. Both men knew Bruno personally, had done business with him, and trusted his judgment. They saw him as exactly the kind of steady, business-minded leader who would keep Philadelphia stable and profitable without creating problems that might spill into New York. The Commission's deliberation was relatively brief. Paulina's case was weak from the start. He had attempted to murder a MAID member without authorization, a clear violation of organizational rules. He had shown poor judgment in both his leadership and his paranoia, and he lacked the support of the powerful New York families, whose backing was essential for any boss to maintain his position. The verdict came down against Paulina. He was removed from any leadership role and effectively discredited. More significantly, the Commission gave Bruno authorization to handle Paulina as he saw fit, including, if he chose, ordering his execution. Here, Angelo Bruno made a decision that would define his leadership style and earn him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Rather than ordering Paulina's death, which would have been entirely justified under organizational rules and which many expected, Bruno chose a different path. He shelved Paulina, removing him from any position of authority but allowing him to live. It was a demonstration of several things. First, it showed Bruno's pragmatic approach to leadership. Killing Paulina would have served no practical purpose. It wouldn't have made Bruno stronger, wouldn't have made the family more profitable, and would have eliminated someone who, even if hostile, posed no real threat once stripped of power. Sparing him cost Bruno nothing while demonstrating restraint and judgment. Second, it signaled Bruno's preference for solutions that minimized violence and bloodshed. Throughout his career, he would consistently choose negotiation over confrontation, arrangements over warfare, and stability over dominance through force. The Paulina decision was an early indicator of this approach. Third, it established Bruno as someone who didn't need to prove his toughness through unnecessary killings. In a world where respect often came from violent reputations, Bruno showed that respect could also come from wisdom, judgment, and success. It was a lesson not all his contemporaries understood, but it would serve him well. In 1959, with the Commission's blessing and the support of the Philadelphia family's membership, Angelo Bruno officially became boss of the Philadelphia crime family. He was 48 years old and had spent nearly 3 decades in organized crime, working his way up through patience, intelligence, and demonstrated ability. His ascension marked the beginning of what would become a 21-year reign, one of the longest and most stable in American organized crime history. Where other cities would see bosses rise and fall through violence, prosecution, or internal rebellion, Philadelphia under Bruno would remain remarkably stable. The characteristics that defined Bruno's leadership were evident from the start. He emphasized earning over empire building, preferring profitable operations to territorial expansion. He maintained strong relationships with other families, particularly in New York, avoiding the conflicts and wars that plagued other organizations. He insisted on discipline and order within his own family, punishing disloyalty severely while rewarding reliability and earning ability. Most distinctively, he cultivated a low profile. While bosses in other cities courted publicity, enjoyed their notoriety, and became household names, Bruno remained largely unknown to the general public. His operations generated enormous profits but minimal headlines. His organization controlled significant territory and numerous rackets, but did so quietly, without the spectacular violence that drew media attention. This approach earned him the nickname the Gentle Don, though those who worked under him understood that gentleness was strategic rather than temperamental. Bruno could be ruthless when necessary. He simply preferred that necessity to arise as rarely as possible. Violence was a tool to be used sparingly, not a first resort or a means of establishing reputation. As the 1950s ended and the new decade began, Angelo Bruno stood at the height of his power. The street kid from Villalba who had arrived in America with nothing now controlled one of the nation's most significant organized crime families. The grocery store clerk who had struggled through the Depression now commanded an empire worth millions. The patient associate who had spent years learning under Marco Reginelli now sat in the boss's chair, ready to build an organization that would dominate Philadelphia for 2 decades. His reign would be marked by prosperity, stability, and the kind of quiet efficiency that made fortunes while avoiding headlines. Philadelphia, under Angelo Bruno's leadership, would become known as one of the most peaceful and profitable territories in American organized crime. And Bruno himself would become a model, for better or worse, of how intelligence, patience, and business acumen could triumph over the more traditional values of violence and intimidation. Chapter 23. Angelo Bruno is the new boss. In 1959, Angelo Bruno assumed leadership of the Philadelphia crime family during a time of significant transition. The position came to him not through violence or upheaval, but through careful succession planning and the endorsement of New York's most powerful families. At 49 years old, Bruno brought a measured, business-like approach that would define Philadelphia's underworld for the next 2 decades. Bruno's first actions as boss revealed his strategic thinking. He confirmed Joseph Rugnetta as consigliere, maintaining continuity with the previous administration. Ignazio Denaro, known as Nats, remained as underboss. These decisions signaled stability to both his own organization and the other families watching Philadelphia's transition. Bruno understood that dramatic changes in leadership often invited chaos, and chaos was bad for business. The new boss emphasized a different philosophy than many of his contemporaries. Where other families pursued aggressive expansion and territorial disputes, Bruno focused on steady income from established operations. Gambling remained the foundation, bookmaking operations, numbers rackets, and organized betting networks throughout the city. Loan sharking provided consistent returns with minimal public attention. The family maintained interests in vending machines, placing them in bars, clubs, and restaurants across the Delaware Valley. Union connections, particularly in the garment and trucking industries, offered both legitimate influence and profitable arrangements. Bruno's business acumen extended far beyond Philadelphia's borders. In the late 1950s, he joined a group of investors in a substantial venture in Havana, Cuba. The Plaza Hotel represented the kind of sophisticated gambling operation that attracted affluent tourists and generated enormous profits. Bruno invested $180,000, equivalent to approximately $2 million today, alongside notable figures including Meyer Lansky, Joseph Stassi, and Carl Ippolito, known as Pappy. Ippolito's stake was even larger, reportedly $300,000, worth roughly $5 million in current value. The investment proved both profitable and prescient. Lloyd's of London acted as reinsurer through the American International Reinsurance Corporation of New York, providing a $70,000 policy on the casino operations. This level of legitimate insurance coverage demonstrated how gambling enterprises operated with standard business protections despite their extralegal nature. The Cuban Revolution, however, changed everything. When Fidel Castro's forces took control in 1959, they moved quickly against foreign gambling interests. On January 21, 1959, a fire damaged the gambling casino at the Plaza Hotel. The circumstances suggested political motivation rather than accident. Castro's supporters made clear their intention to eliminate American influence from Cuba's entertainment industry. Bruno and his partners faced the potential loss of their substantial investment. However, the insurance arrangements proved their worth. In April of 1959, the American International Reinsurance Corporation paid out a claim of $185,000, covering most of the losses from the fire. Bruno's careful attention to legitimate business practices, securing proper insurance, maintaining documentation, working through established corporations protected his investment even in revolutionary circumstances. The collapse of Cuban gambling operations forced a geographic shift. Bruno and his associates redirected their attention to Miami, Florida, where gambling interests could operate with less political volatility. The Montmartre Hotel at 4775 Collins Avenue in Miami Beach became a new focus. Jack Lisitz served as the hotel's treasurer, representing Bruno's interests in the property's management. This arrangement followed Bruno's preferred pattern, maintaining distance from day-to-day operations while ensuring trusted associates protected his investment. Bruno's Miami interests extended beyond hotels. The vending machine business offered steady returns with minimal risk. Sue Bruno, Angela's wife, wrote a check for $50,000, approximately $600,000 in today's currency, for an interest in a Miami vending machine operation. This investment demonstrated the family's diversification strategy and Sue's role in managing certain business affairs. In 1960, the purchase and subsequent sale of Cigarette Service, Incorporated, further illustrated the family's legitimate business portfolio. Back in Philadelphia, however, tensions emerged within the organization. In 1962, underboss Ignacio Denaro grew dissatisfied with his position. The specific sources of his frustration remain unclear. Perhaps he felt overlooked in decision-making or disagreed with Bruno's cautious business approach. Whatever the cause, Denaro made a serious miscalculation. He reached out to contacts in New York, expressing concerns about Bruno's leadership. This appeal to higher authority represented a significant challenge to Bruno's position. In the hierarchical structure of organized crime families, such complaints could undermine a boss's authority and invite interference from more powerful organizations. The New York families, particularly the Gambino organization under Carlo Gambino, held tremendous influence over smaller families like Philadelphia. Gambino's response proved decisive and humiliating for Denaro. Rather than entertaining the underboss's complaints, Gambino sided firmly with Bruno. The message was clear. Bruno enjoyed the complete support of New York's most powerful family. Denaro's attempt to go around his boss had failed spectacularly, and his position within the organization was permanently weakened. This episode accomplished several important outcomes for Bruno. It demonstrated to his own family that he possessed unshakable backing from New York. It discouraged future challenges to his authority. Most importantly, it established Bruno's reputation for resolving conflicts through relationships and diplomacy rather than violence. The incident became a defining moment in what observers would later call the Pax Bruno, a period of unusual stability and peace in Philadelphia. The following year, 1963, brought unexpected public attention to Bruno's position. Joseph Valacchi, a soldier in New York's Genovese family, became the first member of an organized crime family to publicly acknowledge its existence and structure. Testifying before Congress, Valacchi confirmed Angelo Bruno as boss of the Philadelphia family. He estimated the organization's strength at 75 to 100 members, a modest size compared to New York families, but significant for a regional organization. Valachi's testimony introduced terms like La Cosa Nostra to the American public and provided unprecedented insight into the structure and operations of organized crime families. For Bruno, the revelation meant increased law enforcement attention and public scrutiny. However, his careful business practices and avoidance of violence positioned him well to weather the storm. The mid-1960s demonstrated the stark contrast between Philadelphia and New York. While several New York families descended into bloody internal wars, the Gallo-Profaci conflict, the Bonanno crisis, Philadelphia remained remarkably peaceful. Bruno's emphasis on diplomacy, his strong relationships with other families, and his focus on profitable business rather than territorial expansion created an environment of stability. During these years, Bruno continued expanding his international gambling interests. His partnership with Meyer Lansky, one of the most sophisticated financial minds in organized crime, provided access to overseas opportunities. The Colony Sports Club in London represented this international expansion. George Raft, the Hollywood actor known for gangster roles, served as the public face of the operation, a glamorous front that attracted wealthy patrons while obscuring the ownership structure. These overseas ventures demonstrated Bruno's vision for modern organized crime. Rather than relying solely on street-level operations, the numbers rackets, the protection schemes, the neighborhood businesses, he invested in sophisticated gambling operations that served an affluent international clientele. The approach required patience, significant capital investment, and careful attention to legal structures, but it offered returns that traditional operations could never match. Throughout this period, Bruno maintained his residence in Philadelphia, living modestly despite his substantial wealth. He remained connected to the neighborhood, visible in local restaurants and social clubs. This accessibility stood in sharp contrast to bosses who isolated themselves, surrounding themselves with layers of security and distance. Bruno's confidence in his position allowed him to move freely, secure in the knowledge that his relationships and reputation provided better protection than armed guards. The relative peace in Philadelphia attracted notice from law enforcement and journalists studying organized crime. The absence of violence, the lack of public disputes, the smooth operations, all suggested an organization operating with unusual discipline and coordination. Bruno's leadership style emphasized patience over aggression, negotiation over confrontation, and long-term prosperity over short-term gains. As the 1960s progressed, the foundation Bruno had built, the trusted inner circle, the diverse business interests, the strong relationships with other families, the international investments created what would become the longest period of stability in Philadelphia's organized crime history. The peace would not last forever, but for now the Pax Bruno seemed unshakable, a testament to one man's vision of how a crime family could operate in modern America. The story of Angelo Bruno's rise reveals a different kind of power, one built on relationships rather than violence, on business acumen rather than intimidation. In the chapters ahead, we will explore how this peace was maintained, the challenges that tested it, and ultimately, the forces that would bring it to an end. Chapter 24, Consolidating the Power. The summer heat hung heavy over Atlantic City in June 1967 as Angelo Bruno made his way to the Hotel Tremor, the grand beachfront resort, with its distinctive Spanish-style architecture and commanding views of the boardwalk, had been chosen for a meeting of considerable importance. Bruno was joining two of the most powerful men in American organized crime, Carlo Gambino of New York and Joseph Colombo, another New York boss whose star was rising within the commission. These were not casual gatherings. When men of such stature convened, it meant decisions would be made that affected territories, operations, and relationships across the entire eastern seaboard. The meeting itself was brief. State police, acting on intelligence that had somehow reached them, raided the hotel and arrested all three bosses. The charges, however, were flimsy at best. Within hours, Bruno, Gambino, and Colombo were released, the legal proceedings dismissed almost as quickly as they had begun. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. The raid had served notice to law enforcement and to the underworld alike. Angelo Bruno was no longer simply the boss of Philadelphia. He was a national-level statesman within La Cosa Nostra, a man whose counsel was sought by the most influential crime families in the country. This recognition marked the beginning of what would later be remembered as the Pax Bruno, a two-decade era of relative peace and stability for the Philadelphia crime family, where other cities saw bloody succession battles and territorial wars. Philadelphia, under Bruno's leadership, became known for its methodical approach to business and its careful avoidance of unnecessary conflict. It was not weakness that drove this stability, but rather Bruno's deep understanding that violence, while sometimes necessary, was ultimately bad for business. Dead men couldn't earn, and imprisoned men couldn't contribute. Peace, properly maintained, generated far more revenue than war. Central to Bruno's philosophy was an absolute prohibition against cooperation with law enforcement. During his entire reign as boss, not a single member of the Philadelphia family became an informant. This was not merely coincidence or good fortune. Bruno enforced a code that left no room for ambiguity. No friend of ours is supposed to sign any statement with the law, he would say, and this principle was understood by every made member and associate. The consequences for breaking this rule were not discussed because they didn't need to be. Everyone understood that cooperation with authorities meant death, swift and certain. This unwavering stance created an environment of trust within the organization, even as it made the family extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to penetrate. By 1970, Bruno had solidified his leadership structure in ways that reflected both his confidence in certain individuals and his wariness of others. Philip Tester, his longtime friend and ally, was promoted to underboss. Tester had proven himself over the years as both a capable earner and a loyal soldier. He understood Bruno's methods and shared his belief in the importance of discipline and restraint. The promotion recognized not only Tester's contributions, but also his role as Bruno's most trusted lieutenant. Antonio Caponigro, meanwhile, was elevated to the position of consigliere. Caponigro ran operations in Newark and northern New Jersey, territories that required a certain independence from the Philadelphia base. He was a strong earner with his own crew and his own way of doing things. The promotion to consigliere gave him status and recognition while keeping him within the family's formal structure. It was a calculated move on Bruno's part, one that acknowledged Caponigro's importance while ensuring his continued loyalty. Not everyone rose during this reorganization. Frank Chicky Narducci, who had once held significant influence, found himself increasingly sidelined. Bruno's reasons were never explicitly stated, but those close to the boss understood that Narducci's more aggressive instincts and his tendency toward confrontation made him less suitable for positions of greater authority during an era when Bruno was prioritizing stability over expansion through force. The early 1970s brought new opportunities in South Jersey, particularly in the construction industry. The region was experiencing growth, with new highways, shopping centers, and residential developments transforming formerly rural areas into suburban communities. Bruno saw the potential immediately. Construction meant contracts, and contracts meant opportunities for the family to insert itself into every phase of development, from securing the initial bids to supplying materials, providing labor, and managing union relationships. The family's involvement in South Jersey construction was methodical and comprehensive. Through carefully placed associates and cooperative union officials, Bruno's organization gained influence over which companies received which jobs. They controlled concrete suppliers, trucking companies, and labor unions, creating a system where builders who wanted to avoid delays and cost overruns understood the wisdom of cooperation. The beauty of these arrangements was their subtlety. No one needed to be threatened explicitly. The threat was implicit in the system itself. Play along and your project proceeded smoothly, resist, and you faced mysterious shortages, labor troubles, and costly delays. While Bruno expanded operations in South Jersey, he maintained strict control over his volatile capo in Atlantic City, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo. Bruno distrusted Scarfo's methods, particularly his quick resort to violence and his inability to resolve disputes through negotiation. Scarfo had been sent to Atlantic City years earlier, partly as punishment, partly to keep him away from Philadelphia, where his unpredictability could damage the careful equilibrium Bruno had established. Atlantic City in the early 1970s was a backwater, a fading resort town whose glory days seemed long past. Keeping Scarfo there was a form of exile disguised as opportunity. But history has a way of changing the value of things. In 1976, New Jersey voters approved a referendum legalizing casino gambling in Atlantic City. The decision transformed the city overnight from a declining seaside resort into a destination for massive investment. Major casino companies, seeing opportunities to create an East Coast alternative to Las Vegas, began planning enormous resort complexes. Suddenly, Atlantic City was no longer a place of exile. It was potentially one of the most lucrative territories in the entire region. Bruno and Testa recognized the opportunity immediately, though Bruno approached it with characteristic caution. Atlantic City sat at the intersection of several crime family territories. The Genovese family out of New York had long claimed interests in New Jersey. Other families had their own historical connections to the area. For Bruno to simply assert control over casino operations would have violated the territorial agreements that governed organized crime throughout the Northeast. It would have meant war, and war was precisely what Bruno had spent decades avoiding. Initially, Bruno was skeptical about becoming too deeply involved. The presence of the Genovese family and other New York interests gave him pause. But Testa and others convinced him that the opportunities were simply too significant to ignore. The key was negotiation rather than confrontation. Bruno reached out to his counterparts in the other families, particularly the Genovese organization. Conversations were had, arrangements were made, territories were acknowledged. In the end, Bruno agreed to cede a share of Atlantic City operations to the Genovese family in exchange for recognition of Philadelphia's primary interest in the region. The compromise was classic Bruno, pragmatic, diplomatic, and designed to prevent conflict while still securing substantial benefits for his organization. With the territorial question settled, at least for the moment, the Philadelphia family positioned itself to take advantage of the casino boom. The opportunities were extraordinary. Every casino needed to be built, and construction meant contracts for concrete, steel, equipment, and labor. Every casino needed supplies, from linens to food to gaming equipment. Every casino employed hundreds of workers, many of them union members whose representatives could be influenced or controlled. The family made millions of dollars through these various streams. Construction contracts were awarded to companies that understood the wisdom of cooperation. Suppliers who wanted to do business with the casinos learned that certain middlemen needed to be included in their arrangements. Union contracts were negotiated in ways that provided both benefits to workers and opportunities for the family to skim from welfare funds and pension programs. Vendor agreements included provisions for consultants and service providers who existed primarily to funnel money to the organization. Nicodemo Scarfo, the violent capo who had been exiled to Atlantic City as punishment, suddenly found himself at the center of the family's most lucrative operations. His crews controlled access to casino construction sites. His associates held positions in critical unions. His influence extended into city government, where zoning decisions and building permits could make or break development projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Scarfo was no longer an exile, he was a power broker, and he understood that his newfound importance had transformed his relationship with Bruno and the family leadership. But even as the money flowed into Philadelphia family coffers, tension simmered beneath the surface. The arrangement with the Genovese family, while necessary, rankled some members who felt that Philadelphia was giving away too much. Scarfo, emboldened by his new importance and his distance from Bruno's direct oversight, began to operate with increasing independence. And Antonio Caponegro, the consigliere running operations in Newark, watched the Atlantic City riches accumulate while his own territory generated steady but less spectacular returns. Bruno, now in his late 60s, managed these various tensions with the same careful diplomacy that had characterized his entire reign. He maintained his discipline, his code against informants, and his preference for negotiation over violence. The Pax Bruno continued, but the forces that would eventually unravel it were gathering strength. The casino money was simply too vast, the opportunities too tempting, for all parties to remain satisfied with their shares indefinitely. For now, though, the system worked. Philadelphia remained stable while other cities descended into chaos. Bruno remained respected, both within his organization and among his peers on the commission. The 2 decades of peace he had engineered had made the family wealthy and powerful. And if that very success contained the seeds of future conflict, few could see it clearly in the golden glow of Atlantic City's casino lights. The gentle docent, as Bruno was still called, had guided his family through Prohibition, through the post-war years, through periods of expansion and consolidation. He had outlasted rivals, avoided prison, and built an organization that generated millions while maintaining a relatively low profile. It was an extraordinary achievement, one that testified to his intelligence, his patience, and his understanding of how power actually worked. But nothing lasts forever, and the very factors that had made Bruno successful, his caution, his diplomacy, his willingness to share rather than fight, would eventually be seen by some as weaknesses rather than strengths. The younger generation, men who had known only success and had never experienced the consequences of all-out war, were growing restless. They looked at the casino millions and wondered why Philadelphia needed to share with New York. They looked at Bruno's measured approach and saw an old man who had lost his edge. These tensions remained largely unspoken in the mid-1970s. Bruno's authority was still absolute, his word still law within the family. But the Atlantic City gold rush had changed the equation in fundamental ways. It had elevated Scarfo from exile to importance. It had created new revenue streams so vast that the traditional ways of dividing proceeds seemed inadequate. And it had attracted the attention of families who might previously have been content to leave Philadelphia to its own affairs. The Pax Bruno would continue for several more years, but the era of unchallenged stability was entering its final phase. The forces that Bruno had so carefully balanced, ambition, greed, rivalry, and violence, were building pressure beneath the surface calm. When they finally erupted, the explosion would be catastrophic, destroying not only the peace Bruno had built, but ultimately claiming his own life. But that reckoning still lay in the future. For now, the gentle docent still ruled, Atlantic City's casinos rose toward the sky, and the Philadelphia family continued to prosper under the longest period of stability any American crime family had known. Chapter 25. The Forbidden Trade in Hypocrisy. In the world Angelo Bruno had carefully constructed, nothing threatened stability quite like narcotics. Throughout the early 1970s, Bruno maintained an ironclad public position. His family would not traffic in drugs. This policy, articulated clearly to every capo and soldier, represented more than moral posturing. Bruno understood the mathematics of federal attention. Drug cases brought mandatory sentences. Drug cases attracted FBI task forces. Drug cases turned loyal men into government witnesses. Bruno's reasoning carried weight among the older generation. They had watched families in New York and New Jersey fracture under drug prosecutions. They had seen bosses receive life sentences for conspiracies that generated millions, but cost them everything. Bruno presented his anti-narcotics stance as protection, as wisdom learned from others' mistakes. Yet in the shadows of this proclaimed principle lived a profound contradiction. Carlo Gambino, the most powerful boss in New York, had maintained close ties with Bruno since the commission meetings of the 1950s. Their relationship transcended simple alliance. Gambino viewed Bruno as a reliable partner in a world increasingly populated by ambitious young men who lacked patience and judgment. In the mid-1970s, certain relatives of the Gambino family expressed interest in establishing heroin distribution networks in the Philadelphia area. The profits from this trade dwarfed traditional rackets. A successful operation could generate more revenue in months than a gambling network produced in years. Bruno faced a delicate decision. Refusing Gambino risked offending his most important ally. Allowing the operation contradicted everything he told his own men about avoiding narcotics. His solution reflected the calculated duplicity that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. Bruno quietly permitted the Gambino-connected dealers to operate in Philadelphia and across the river in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He imposed conditions, of course. The operation would remain small and controlled. Distribution would avoid neighborhoods where Bruno's legitimate political connections might notice. Most importantly, Philadelphia family members would not participate directly. In exchange for this permission and his silence, Bruno received a personal cut of the profits. The exact percentage remains unclear, lost in the accounting that exists only in memory and rumor. What matters is the principle it established. Angelo Bruno, who forbade his own men from touching narcotics, was profiting from the heroin trade. Word travels in organized crime through channels that bypass official family hierarchy. Soldiers talk to soldiers. Capos hear fragments over dinner. Associates pass information that might prove valuable later. By 1976, the basic outline of Bruno's arrangement with the Gambino dealers had reached attentive ears throughout the Philadelphia family. The reaction varied by generation and temperament. Older capos who remembered the Depression and understood Bruno's broader strategic thinking generally accepted his decision as a boss's prerogative. They had seen enough to know that absolute consistency was impossible in a world built on controlled illegality. Younger members, particularly those in their 40s who had come up during the prosperous 1960s, viewed the situation differently. They saw their boss prohibiting them from the most lucrative criminal enterprise of the era, while personally profiting from that same trade. The hypocrisy struck them as both unfair and unsustainable. Among these dissatisfied voices, Antonio Caponegros grew loudest. Antonio Caponegro had earned his nickname Tony Bananas through some long-forgotten incident that no one quite remembered but everyone referenced. By 1978, he held the position of consigliere, making him theoretically the family's chief advisor and mediator. The role suited his personality poorly. Caponegro possessed neither the diplomatic temperament nor the strategic patience that characterized Bruno's long reign. Where Bruno calculated and delayed, Caponegro acted on impulse. Where Bruno built consensus gradually, Caponegro expected immediate deference to his opinions. Born in Newark in 1912, Caponegro had spent his formative years in the New Jersey branch of what would become the Philadelphia family's northern operations. He understood labor racketeering, controlled gambling operations in Newark's Italian neighborhoods, and maintained relationships with several New York families through geographic proximity and shared interests. His elevation to consigliere had occurred partly through attrition as older members died or retired, and partly through his alliance with Bruno during internal disputes in the 1960s. But by the late 1970s, Caponegro increasingly viewed his loyalty as unrewarded and his counsel as ignored. The narcotics issue crystallized his resentment. Caponegro saw enormous profit potential that Bruno's policies prevented him from pursuing. He watched Gambino-connected dealers operate with Bruno's blessing, while Philadelphia family members were threatened with death for similar activities. The arrangement struck him as both hypocritical and economically foolish. If narcotics policy represented one source of discontent, Bruno's handling of Atlantic City opportunities provided another. In 1976, New Jersey voters approved a referendum legalizing casino gambling in Atlantic City. The decision promised to transform a decaying resort town into an East Coast Las Vegas. For organized crime families with interests in New Jersey, the casino development represented the opportunity of a generation. Construction contracts, labor unions, loan sharking to gamblers, and potential infiltration of casino operations themselves. The possibilities seemed endless. Bruno approached Atlantic City with his characteristic caution. He recognized federal authorities would scrutinize every aspect of casino development. He understood that obvious criminal involvement would bring prosecution and potentially threaten the licenses of legitimate casino operators. He advocated patience, subtle influence, and long-term positioning rather than immediate aggressive moves. This restraint infuriated several capos, Capo Negro among them. They watched Genovese family representatives from New York establish relationships with construction companies. They saw opportunities for immediate profit through union control and contract steering disappearing, while Bruno counseled patience. From Caponegro's perspective, Bruno's conservative approach to Atlantic City reinforced a pattern. The boss consistently chose stability over profit, caution over opportunity, and personal control over family advancement. The combination of the narcotics hypocrisy and Atlantic City hesitation created a narrative that Caponegro began articulating to receptive listeners. By late 1978, Caponegro had moved beyond private complaints. He began carefully testing sentiment among certain capos and soldiers, gauging their frustration with Bruno's policies. His approach remained indirect initially, questions rather than statements, observations rather than proposals. He mentioned to one capo how much money New York families were making from heroin distribution. He observed to another how Atlantic City opportunities were being claimed by outsiders, while Philadelphia's own interests were neglected. He suggested to a third that Bruno's age, he would turn 70 in 1980, perhaps affected his judgment and energy. 3 men proved particularly receptive to Caponegro's suggestions: Frank Sindone, John Simone, and Alfred Salerno. Frank "Chicky" Sindone had grown up in South Philadelphia and established himself in family operations during the 1960s. He specialized in labor racketeering and controlled several unions useful for extortion and contract steering. Ambitious and impatient, Sindone resented what he viewed as artificial constraints on his earning potential. John Simone, based in Newark like Caponegro, had built a successful loan sharking operation that extended into labor union pension funds. He shared Caponegro's frustration with Bruno's Atlantic City caution, seeing immediate opportunities for pension fund loans to casino developers that Bruno's hesitation prevented. Alfred Salerno operated primarily in New Jersey's gambling rackets. He maintained relationships with Genovese family members in New York and had heard their perspectives on Bruno's supposedly outdated approach to modern criminal opportunities. Together, these 4 men, Caponegro, Sindone, Simone, and Salerno, represented a faction united by economic frustration and personal ambition. They did not constitute a majority of the family's leadership, but they controlled enough operations and commanded sufficient respect among soldiers to pose a serious threat to Bruno's authority. As 1978 turned to 1979, Caponegro's whisper campaign evolved into something more dangerous, an actual conspiracy. He began floating the possibility of removing Bruno from power, not openly, not to everyone, but carefully to the men he believed would support such a move. Caponegro operated under a critical assumption that would prove fatal. He believed that the commission, the ruling body of bosses from New York's 5 families, would approve or at least accept Bruno's removal. His reasoning contained several elements. First, Caponegro convinced himself that Bruno's conservative policies frustrated not only Philadelphia members but also New York bosses who saw profit potential being wasted. He pointed to the Atlantic City situation as evidence that Bruno's caution was limiting opportunities for everyone. Second, Caponegro believed his long-standing relationships with certain New York family members would translate into support, or at least neutrality. His geographic proximity to New York and his business dealings there created what he interpreted as alliances that would protect him after Bruno's removal. Third, and most dangerously, Caponegro assumed that the commission would prioritize profit over precedent. He thought the bosses would recognize that removing a leader who limited earning potential made practical business sense. Each of these assumptions contained fatal flaws that Caponigro either failed to recognize or chose to ignore. The commission operated on principles that transcended simple profit calculation. Stability, hierarchy, and the sanctity of boss authority represented foundational values that supported the entire organizational structure. No boss could support removing another boss without commission approval, regardless of policy disagreements, without undermining the principle that protected his own authority. What Caponigro interpreted as New York frustration with Bruno's policies was actually respect for a boss who maintained control and avoided bringing heat on himself or his allies. But in early 1979, convinced of his reasoning and supported by his co-conspirators, Antonio Caponigro began planning something unprecedented in Philadelphia family history. He would eliminate Angelo Bruno and claim leadership of the family. The decision would trigger consequences that none of the conspirators anticipated, setting in motion events that would ultimately destroy not just them, but the entire stable structure Bruno had spent 3 decades building. As winter settled over Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno continued his daily routines, unaware that his consigliere and trusted advisor was orchestrating his murder. The gentle Don, who had survived so many challenges through patience and political skill, now faced a threat emerging from within his own family's leadership. The narcotics hypocrisy that Bruno had carefully managed for years would finally produce its inevitable cost. His refusal to share the profits that he himself collected would prove his undoing. The stability he prized above all else was about to shatter, and with it would collapse the peaceful era that had made the Philadelphia family unique among America's organized crime organizations. The forbidden trade, conducted in shadow while publicly condemned, had poisoned relationships and bred the resentment that now threatened to explode into violence. Angelo Bruno's longest-running contradiction was about to claim its ultimate price. Chapter 26: The Assassination of Angelo Bruno and Aftermath. The evening of March 21, 1980, began like countless others for Angelo Bruno. The 70-year-old Don had spent the day attending to business matters, maintaining the careful balance that had defined his leadership for 21 years. As darkness settled over South Philadelphia, Bruno prepared to return to his modest row house on Snyder Avenue, the same neighborhood where he had lived for decades, among the people he had grown up with. John Stanford, a trusted associate who often served as Bruno's driver, picked up the Don that evening. Stanford, a Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in Philadelphia in 1964, had earned Bruno's confidence through years of reliable service. The two men drove through the familiar streets of South Philadelphia, past the social clubs and corner stores that formed the landscape of Bruno's world. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, Stanford guided the car to a stop outside Bruno's home on Snyder Avenue. The street was quiet, lined with the brick row houses typical of the neighborhood. Stanford remained behind the wheel while Bruno sat in the passenger seat, perhaps finishing a conversation or simply taking a moment before going inside to his wife Sue. In the darkness, a figure approached the passenger side of the vehicle. Before either man could react, the assassin raised a shotgun and fired a single blast through the window. The shot struck Angelo Bruno in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The Docile Don, the man who had maintained peace through reason and restraint for more than 2 decades, died in a fraction of a second, less than 30 feet from his own front door. John Stanford, sitting mere inches away, survived the attack unharmed. The gunman fled into the night, disappearing into the maze of South Philadelphia streets. Stanford, splattered with his boss's blood, would later claim he saw nothing useful, no clear view of the shooter. No distinguishing features, nothing that could help identify who had just murdered the head of the Philadelphia crime family. The sound of the shotgun blast brought neighbors rushing to their windows and doors. Someone called the police. Within minutes, South Philadelphia's quiet streets were filled with the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. Homicide detectives arrived to find Angelo Bruno's body slumped in the passenger seat. The violence of his death, a stark contrast to the peaceful neighborhood setting, News of Bruno's assassination spread rapidly through Philadelphia's underworld. The shock was profound and immediate. For 21 years, Angelo Bruno had maintained what law enforcement called the Quiet Era, a period of relative stability unprecedented in the city's organized crime history. He had settled disputes through negotiation, avoided unnecessary violence, and built cooperative relationships with other crime families across the country. His murder represented not just the death of a man, but the shattering of an entire philosophy of leadership. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission, which had monitored Bruno's activities for years, noted the seismic nature of the event. In their reports, commission members observed that ordinary Philadelphians, who had lived comfortably ignorant of organized crime's presence, were suddenly confronted with a brutal murder in a residential neighborhood. The assassination wasn't hidden in some remote location or explained away as a simple robbery. It was a public execution that announced a dramatic change in how Philadelphia's underworld would operate. Law enforcement officials gathered at the scene recognized immediately that Bruno's death created a dangerous power vacuum. For more than 2 decades, the family had operated under clear leadership with established rules and hierarchies. Now that structure was gone, removed in a single shotgun blast. Detectives knew from experience that such vacuums rarely remained empty for long, and the struggle to fill them was typically violent. In the hours and days following the assassination, investigators began piecing together possible motives and suspects. The manner of the killing, a close-range shotgun blast, executed with precision, suggested a professional hit rather than a crime of passion or random violence. Someone had ordered Angelo Bruno's death, and someone had carried out that order with cold efficiency. Law enforcement sources quickly focused their attention on Antonio Caponigro, known throughout Philadelphia's underworld as Tony Bananas. Caponigro held the position of consigliere in the Bruno family, theoretically serving as an advisor and mediator. However, investigators had long suspected that Caponigro harbored ambitions beyond his advisory role. Unlike Bruno, who favored subtle influence and peaceful resolution, Caponigro was known for his volatile temperament and aggressive business approach. The nickname Tony Bananas had followed Caponigro for years, though its origin remained somewhat mysterious. Some claimed it referred to his fruit vendor background, others to perceived mental instability. Regardless of its source, the nickname had become his permanent identifier in police reports and street conversations. At 60 years old, Caponigro had spent decades in organized crime, working his way up through the family's ranks to achieve one of its highest positions. As consigliere, Caponigro was based primarily in Newark, New Jersey, overseeing the family's interests in that city and northern New Jersey. This geographic distance from Bruno's South Philadelphia base had given Caponigro a degree of independence in his operations. He controlled gambling operations, loan sharking enterprises, and various legitimate businesses throughout his territory. His crews were known to be more violent than Bruno's Philadelphia soldiers, reflecting their leader's different philosophy. Investigators also identified several of Caponigro's key associates as potential participants in the plot. Frank Sindone, known in police files as Frankie Flowers, was a longer-time soldier in Caponigro's crew. Sindone had earned his nickname through his practice of sending flowers to the funerals of his victims, a gesture some saw as mockery, others as superstition. He was known for his expertise in loan sharking operations and his willingness to use violence to collect debts. John Simone, another member of Caponigro's inner circle, had a reputation as a reliable soldier. Simone's background included various arrests for gambling and assault, though he had managed to avoid lengthy prison sentences. His loyalty to Caponigro was considered absolute, making him a natural suspect in any conspiracy involving the consigliere. Alfred Salerno completed the core group of suspects. Salerno had worked closely with Caponigro for years, handling various enforcement duties and business matters. Law enforcement files documented his involvement in numerous criminal enterprises throughout northern New Jersey, always operating under Caponigro's direction. To understand the significance of Bruno's assassination, it's essential to examine the organizational structure that governed American organized crime families. Since the 1930s, the major Italian-American crime families had operated under an informal governing body known as the Commission. This council, composed of bosses from the most powerful families, served to mediate disputes, approve major decisions, and maintain some degree of order among competing criminal organizations. The Commission's primary purpose was to prevent the kind of destructive gang warfare that had marked earlier eras of organized crime. The bloodshed of the 1920s and early 1930s had drawn intense law enforcement attention and disrupted profitable criminal enterprises. The Commission established rules designed to minimize conflict and maximize profit for all member families. Among these rules, one stood paramount: no family boss could be killed without the Commission's approval. This rule existed for practical reasons. The assassination of a boss inevitably created instability, not just within that family, but potentially across the entire network of crime families. Succession disputes could trigger violence that spread beyond family boundaries, especially when families had business relationships or shared territories. By requiring Commission approval for any hit on a boss, the organization hoped to prevent unauthorized power plays and maintain predictable leadership transitions. Angelo Bruno had been a respected member of the Commission, representing Philadelphia's interests in the national organization. His moderate approach and diplomatic skills had made him valuable in mediating disputes between other families. Bruno understood the importance of the Commission's rules and had consistently operated within them throughout his tenure as boss. He had survived as long as he did, partly because he never threatened other families' interests and always sought Commission approval for major decisions. If Antonio Caponigro had indeed ordered Bruno's murder, he had done so in flagrant violation of the Commission's most sacred rule. Such a violation would not go unanswered. The Commission's authority depended on enforcing its decisions and punishing those who acted independently. No boss could feel secure if subordinates could murder their leaders without consequences. The question facing investigators wasn't just who killed Angelo Bruno, but whether that killing had been authorized, and if not, what the Commission would do about it. Understanding why anyone would want Angelo Bruno dead required examining the tensions that had built beneath the surface of his peaceful reign. While Bruno had maintained outward stability, not everyone in the family agreed with his conservative approach to business opportunities, particularly regarding the narcotics trade. By 1980, drug trafficking had become enormously profitable for many organized crime families. Cities like New York had seen certain families embrace the heroin and cocaine trade, generating millions of dollars in revenue. Bruno, however, had maintained his prohibition against family involvement in narcotics. He believed drug dealing brought too much law enforcement attention and violated his code of avoiding activities that directly harmed the community. This policy had frustrated some family members, including Antonio Caponigro. From his base in Newark, Caponigro could see the profits being made by New York families deeply involved in drug trafficking. His own gambling and loan sharking operations were profitable, but they couldn't match the revenue potential of narcotics. Some investigators believed Caponigro viewed Bruno's drug prohibition as outdated thinking that cost the family millions in potential earnings. Beyond the drug issue, there were questions about territory and expansion. Bruno's cautious approach had kept the family stable, but hadn't led to significant territorial growth. Other families had expanded their influence into new cities and new criminal enterprises. Some in Bruno's organization wondered whether a more aggressive leader might bring greater opportunities and profits. Personal ambition also factored into possible motives. Caponigro had served as consigliere for years, always in an advisory role rather than wielding direct power. Some men are content with influence behind the throne, others crave the throne itself. Investigators suspected that Caponigro might have tired of offering advice and wanted to make decisions himself. With Bruno dead, Caponigro might have believed he could seize control of the family, or at least expand his own power base. There were also whispers about Atlantic City, which had legalized gambling in 1976. The casino industry was beginning to boom, offering enormous opportunities for both legitimate investment and traditional organized crime activities. Bruno had established the family's position in Atlantic City, but some believed his approach was too cautious, missing opportunities that a more aggressive leader would seize. Control of Atlantic City's criminal enterprises could be worth millions annually, potentially enough to motivate murder. The investigation also had to consider John Stanford's role and survival. As the only witness to Bruno's murder, Stanford's account would be crucial to any prosecution. Yet Stanford claimed to have seen nothing useful. He told police that the shooter approached from behind and fired before either man could react. The darkness and the speed of the attack, Stanford insisted, had prevented him from identifying the assassin. This explanation satisfied no one. Investigators found it difficult to believe that a gunman could approach the car, position himself to fire, and pull the trigger without the driver noticing something: a face, a build, a distinctive feature of any kind. The assassination appeared planned and deliberate, not a random act. How could Stanford, sitting inches from Bruno, survive completely unharmed while his passenger was killed? The precision suggested the shooter knew exactly where Bruno would be sitting and took care not to harm the driver. Several theories emerged. The most innocent explanation was that Stanford genuinely saw nothing in the darkness and shock of the moment, and the assassin simply showed skilled precision in targeting only Bruno. A more cynical interpretation suggested Stanford might have been complicit in the murder, positioning the car in a specific spot and ensuring Bruno sat in the passenger seat where the shooter could reach him. This theory painted Stanford as part of the conspiracy, deliberately providing access to the target. A middle ground suggested that Stanford might know more than he was telling but feared retaliation if he cooperated with police. In the world Bruno had governed, speaking to law enforcement was considered the ultimate betrayal. Even if Stanford had information, coming forward with it would mark him as an informant, potentially signing his own death warrant. Better to claim ignorance and accept investigators' suspicion than to violate the code of silence and face certain consequences. Stanford's background added another layer to the investigation. As a Sicilian immigrant with ties to organized crime in his homeland, Stanford represented a different generation and culture than Bruno's American Rome leadership. Some wondered whether old-world Sicilian traditions and loyalties might have played a role in the assassination, though no clear evidence supported this theory. While investigators pursued leads, Philadelphia's underworld tried to process what had happened. For 21 years, family members had operated under clear rules and stable leadership. Disputes were settled through mediation, not murder. Violence was discouraged, not celebrated. Cooperation with other families was encouraged, not forbidden. Bruno's death announced that this era had ended. Soldiers and associates throughout the family found themselves in an uncertain position. Without clear leadership, they didn't know whose orders to follow or how to conduct business. The consigliere, who might have been expected to provide guidance, was the prime suspect in the boss's murder. The underboss, Philip Tester, was the logical successor, but would the commission confirm him? Would Caponigro try to seize power? Would other families try to take advantage of Philadelphia's instability? Business relationships with other criminal organizations became strained. The New York families that had cooperated with Bruno for decades didn't know who spoke for Philadelphia now. Deals were put on hold. Shipments were delayed. The network of relationships that Bruno had carefully constructed began to fray without his steady presence maintaining them. Law enforcement noticed the change immediately. Informants reported increased tension in social clubs and meeting places. Conversations that had been casual and relaxed became guarded and suspicious. Men who had operated openly for years suddenly became harder to locate, as if anticipating violence and taking precautions. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission documented these changes, noting that the assassination had transformed Philadelphia's organized crime landscape overnight. In New York, the commission was already meeting to discuss Bruno's death. The bosses of the 5 families, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families, recognized that this wasn't just Philadelphia's problem. Bruno had been one of them, a member of their council. His murder without authorization represented a direct challenge to their collective authority. Commission members had to consider several questions. First, had they authorized the hit? The answer appeared to be no record existed of any request to remove Bruno, and commission bosses later confirmed they had not approved such action. This meant the killing violated their fundamental rule, requiring a response that would reaffirm their authority. Second, who was responsible? While Caponegro was the obvious suspect, the commission needed certainty before acting. Killing the wrong person would compound the error and undermine their credibility. They needed to identify not just who pulled the trigger, but who gave the order and why. Third, what message did they need to send? The Commission's power rested on the belief that its rules would be enforced. If someone could murder a boss without permission and escape consequences, the entire system would collapse. Every boss would wonder if his own underboss or consigliere might be plotting against him. The Commission had to demonstrate that violating their rules brought swift and terrible punishment. Finally, what would happen to the Philadelphia family? Even if they punished Bruno's killers, the family still needed leadership. Philip Tester seemed the logical choice, but the Commission had to ensure he could maintain control and restore stability. They couldn't allow Philadelphia to descend into chaos or become vulnerable to other families' encroachment. These deliberations took place quietly, away from public view and law enforcement surveillance. Commission meetings were carefully arranged and attended only by the most senior bosses, who understood the need for absolute secrecy. The decisions reached in these meetings would determine not just the fate of Bruno's killers, but the future direction of organized crime in Philadelphia and beyond. As March turned to April, Philadelphia homicide detectives continued gathering evidence. They interviewed neighbors who heard the shotgun blast, canvassed the area for witnesses, and analyzed the crime scene for forensic evidence. They built timelines of Bruno's final day, documenting his movements and meetings. They examined his business dealings for potential conflicts that might have motivated murder. The FBI also involved itself in the investigation. Bruno's position as a commission member made his death a matter of national significance in the organized crime world. Federal agents had monitored Bruno for decades and maintained extensive files on his activities and associates. They shared information with local police while conducting their own parallel investigation. Both agencies faced a common obstacle, the code of silence that governed organized crime. Men who might have witnessed something wouldn't speak to police. Business associates who might know about internal family tensions refused interviews. Even civilians in South Philadelphia, who generally cooperated with law enforcement, became close-mouthed when questions touched on Bruno or organized crime. The neighborhood protected its own, even in death. Wiretaps and surveillance picked up fragments of conversations, hints of tension and fear in the family. Associates spoke carefully on the phone, aware that law enforcement might be listening. Meeting locations changed frequently, suggesting increased security consciousness. The family was circling its wagons, protecting itself against both external investigation and internal threats. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from the crime scene was processed. The shotgun pellets were analyzed, though they provided little useful information. The weapon was likely a common sporting shotgun, untraceable without the gun itself. The car's interior was examined for fingerprints, again with limited results. The shooter had been careful, or lucky, or both. Detectives knew that solving Bruno's murder would likely require someone from inside the organization to come forward with information. Either a family member would break the code of silence to avenge their murdered boss, or investigators would have to cultivate an informant willing to risk everything to help them. Both approaches took time, and time was something Philadelphia's underworld didn't have much of. The vacuum left by Bruno's death was beginning to pull in forces that would reshape the family forever. As investigators worked and the commission deliberated, others reflected on what Angelo Bruno's death meant for his legacy. For 21 years, he had provided steady leadership based on principles that often conflicted with the violent stereotypes of organized crime. He had built cooperation instead of conflict, sought negotiation instead of war, and created prosperity through stability rather than aggression. Now, less than a month after his death, his era was already being called the Quiet Era, as if it had been an anomaly, an unusual pause in the natural state of organized crime violence. Some family members who had chafed under his conservative rules spoke more openly about changing direction, pursuing new opportunities, embracing a more aggressive approach. The narcotics prohibition was already being questioned. If Bruno was gone, why maintain his outdated rules? Others saw his murder as a terrible mistake, the destruction of something valuable that could never be rebuilt. These men, mostly older soldiers who had prospered under Bruno's leadership, recognized that stability had its own value. They had enjoyed 2 decades of profitable operations without the constant threat of gang warfare. They had raised families and built legitimate businesses alongside their criminal enterprises, all because Bruno had created an environment where longer-term planning was possible. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission, in its analysis of Bruno's assassination, noted the irony. Angelo Bruno had survived as boss longer than most, not through violence and intimidation, but through exactly the opposite approach. He had made himself valuable to other families, created relationships built on trust, and avoided making enemies who would want him dead. Yet in the end, his own organization had turned on him, suggesting that perhaps the old ways of ruling through fear had their advantages after all. Philadelphia itself seemed to mourn in its own way. The city had grown comfortable with Bruno's quiet presence, barely aware of organized crime's existence despite its constant activity. The shocking violence of his death on a residential street shattered that comfortable ignorance. Newspaper editorials questioned how such things could happen in Philadelphia neighborhoods. Politicians called for crackdowns on organized crime. The publicity Bruno had always avoided now flooded over his memory. In those uncertain days after the shotgun blast on Snyder Avenue, few could have predicted just how completely Angelo Bruno's death would transform Philadelphia's underworld. The investigation would continue for weeks and months, revealing connections and conspiracies that reached far beyond a single murder. The commission would act, and its response would send its own message through organized crime families across America. But in late March 1980, as Angelo Bruno's body was prepared for burial and investigators worked to identify his killer, one thing was already clear: the quiet era had ended. What would replace it was still uncertain, but the shot that killed the Docile Don had announced that Philadelphia's crime family was entering a new and dangerous chapter in its history. The peace Bruno had maintained for 21 years died with him on that dark street in South Philadelphia, and what came next would make his era seem, in retrospect, like a golden age of stability that his successors would never recapture. The man who had built his power on avoiding violence had met his end through violence. The Don who had survived by making himself essential to others had been murdered despite all those careful relationships. And the family that had prospered under his cautious guidance was about to discover what happens when caution gives way to ambition, when stability gives way to chaos, and when the rules that protected everyone are suddenly broken by those hungry for power at any cost.